Hey guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is the AP Biology Chapter 14 lecture over Gregor Mendel and his ideas. So like always, we need to start off with some vocab. Hopefully these terms are some refreshers, but inheritance is going to be anything, it's going to describe the passing of things from one generation to the next. You also might have called that heritability. These are all, notice the root, the H-E-R-I-T in there, that's the thing you should look for. That's the kind of the etymological key that you're talking about, something going from one generation to the next. We've known about inheritance for thousands of years, and we've spent a ton of time trying to figure out how it works. What's the molecule passed from parent to offspring? How does it work? How are we what we are? So the scientific study of inheritance is genetics. Like it says on the screen there, it's relatively new. Gregor Mendel did his work in the 1860s, so my number is a little bit behind there. I need to update that, but it's relatively new when you think about, the grand time scales of things like evolution and things like, I don't know, quantum mechanics. Maybe quantum mechanics is a bad idea, but planetary movements and things like that. We haven't been studying genetics all that long. So there are some theories. How does inheritance work? Well, originally we kind of looked at kids and we said, well, that he's got his mom's eyes and his dad's ears, so there must be something that mixed. And notice that in the blending theory, traits are like paints. You mix them together, red and white make pink. Incubation theory is the idea that only one parent controlled the traits of children, because maybe you're like me and you have heard your whole life that you look like your mom, or you've heard your whole life you look like your dad. So that kind of led some people to think maybe only one parent controls the traits of the children. Examples there: Spermists and Ovists. You can imagine which parent they think controlled maybe they thought controlled the traits of the children. And then the particulate model, parents pass on their traits as discrete units that retain their identities in the offspring. That's a lot of big words that says what we know to be true. We pass on alleles, alleles figure themselves out in the next generation. Mendel published his paper in 1866, but he wasn't really recognized by a scientific community until the early 1900s. So that's a pretty long lag for something as big as Mendelian inheritance. So why was Mendel successful? He used an experimental approach. Excuse me, remember we're talking about the 1860s here, so we don't have computers or advanced data analysis or anything along those lines. He's using an experimental approach. He's controlling his variables. He's controlling which organisms breed, and then he applies math to the study of natural phenomena. So he applies math to these experiments. And the fact that he was able to do so many iterations or so many different versions made the math work. You guys have seen, as well as I have, oftentimes in high school we do one set of any lab experiment that we're doing. We do one set. We might do 3 different setups, so we might have a serial dilution or something like that, but we don't do 10 versions of 1 molar hydrochloric acid, 10 versions of 5 molar, things like that. So Mendel did multiple iterations that let the math work itself out. Mendel was a pea picker. He tried several different organisms before he got to peas. He tried rats, and he tried bees and some things like that, but Mendel was a monk. And so your boss doesn't tend to enjoy there being a whole bunch of extra bees buzzing around. And rats cause their own sets of issues. So luckily Mendel kind of switched gears and chose peas. And there were some reasons that he chose peas. They have a short lifespan, so you can get information quickly from one generation to the next. You don't have to wait 9 months like you would have to if you were using humans for this, or 2 years if you were using elephants for this type of testing. They have a short gestation period. Peas are bisexual. They have male parts and female parts. They have many traits known. You can cross-pollinate, you can self-pollinate, so that really helps you control the genetics of the next generation eventually. And then there's something to do with them. So unlike the rats and the bees, the accidents are good things here. So peas aren't pests. I use this term cross-pollination. When you hear the term cross-pollination, you think 2 parents. it's going to result in a hybrid offspring because you're cross-pollinating. If you're self-pollinating, you're going to have one parent. That's going to be asexual reproduction, or you're talking about self-pollination, where you've got a male part and a female part on your own plant, and you're still sexually fertilizing those eggs. Remember, when we say sex in a biology standpoint or a biology setting, we don't mean the verb sex. Sex is a noun for us. So sex, that's not true. It's still a verb, but we're not talking about the action of having sex like you sometimes hear humans talk about it. When we talk about sexual reproduction, we're talking about a haploid gamete and a haploid gamete meet and fertilize to make a diploid zygote. Here's kind of Mendel's technique. We got the parental generation up there. The stamens and the carpel are the male and female parts. You take the pollen from the stamen, put it in the carpel. I'm sorry, backwards. You take the pollen from the carpel, put it in the stamen. That leads to the next generation. This is the fertilization event right here, and that's going to lead to the F1 generation. Like I said, self-pollination is one flower as both parents. Happens a lot in peace, happens a lot in nature, but that results in purebred offspring because you're cloning. You're not losing half your DNA, you're sending all of it. So Mendel used 7 characteristics with 2 expressions or traits, meaning like you're either tall or short. In peas, there's not the height gradient that we see in humans. You're either tall or you're short. That's so important for you to keep in mind as we move through the next month and a half, 2 months where we're studying genetics. For Mendel's patterns to work, the trait has to be either or. Anything where there's a range of traits, Mendelian inheritance is not what's going on there. There's something else at play. So, like I said, tall or short is an example. You know where this is headed. Eventually, this is headed towards Punnett squares and things like that. So a monohybrid cross are going to be crosses that work on a single character at a time. So that's a 4-box Punnett square. Those are the easy ones that we all learned in middle school, and that's kind of our comfort zone here. There's some kind of screwy terminology that goes into Mendelian inheritance when you start talking about the generations, and this is something that I struggle with. I do my best to make sure I'm intentional about the words I'm using and things along those lines, but I often mess this up. So, like I said, I'm going to do my best. Try to help me when you can. So the P generation is the parental generation. Then you're going to have offspring generations. To me, that's where it gets confusing, because F1 is really the second generation. It's the first filial generation. And then F2 is the second filial generation. And filial is, if you were to Google it, it's defined as from a son or daughter. So it's saying that's the first offspring generation, the first test generation. We know what the parents are. F1 is the first experimental group. F2 is the second experimental group. And notice that F2 isn't a second reproduction of the P generation, it's grandchildren. It's mating 2 of the F1s together to form an F2. Sorry about that background there. But here's Mendel's kind of an overview of his experimentation. Mendel took purple and white flowers that were true breeding, meaning they had been self-pollinated. Then the F1 generation, all the plants had purple flowers. F2 generation, we had about 3/4 purple, about 1/4 white. So remember, our theories are Spermists, Ovists, male controls all the traits, female controls all the traits. Blending, where purple and white would make, I don't know, light purple. Not an art major, so I don't know what white and purple would make. And so this, to me, and to Mendel, suggested that these traits were being passed as discrete units that were then somehow being sorted out. These white flowered plants would not have been present if there was blending or if one parent was controlling all the traits. So in all crosses, the F1 showed only one of the traits. Remember, he's looking at seven different traits, and it was not tied to or correlated with gender of the plant. The other trait appeared in F2 about 25% of the time. Again, that's our expected ratio. All right, so this picture shows all the traits that Mendel studied. Again, remember they're either or. As we scroll through, flowers are either purple or white. Their position is either axial, where they stick out to the side, or terminal, where they stick out the end. Seeds are either yellow or green. They're either round or wrinkled. That's like the peas. So if you've ever eaten peas, if you're somebody like me that likes vegetables, you've seen these kind of shrunken peas. Same thing with the pod shape. Sometimes you can really see the peas, sometimes the pods are inflated. Again, either or, there's not really a range of those. Pod color, green or yellow, and then stem length, tall or dwarf. So you're either tall or short. If you look over here, our ratios are pretty close. I guess I should look at the ratio itself. The ratios are all pretty close. Now, you know, in experiments, never works out as clean as it does on a Punnett square, but we're really, really close to that 3-to-1 ratio in all of these. So that suggests that the same inheritance pattern is controlling the expression of all of those traits. One last thing before we move on from this slide. Notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 traits that Mendel studied. Crazy enough, there are 7 chromosomes in peas. Talk about being crazy lucky. Think about all of the traits that are on our chromosome 1, or our chromosome 2, or our chromosome 3. Mendel lucked into an organism, because of the things we talked about earlier, he lucked into an organism that had 1 trait per chromosome. So when he's studying these inheritance, he doesn't have to decode linked genes. He doesn't have to decode crossing over. He's got true chromosomal meiotic inheritance happening. That's pretty crazy. It's a pretty big stroke of luck for him to have come across that. So what did Mendel come up with? He said genes have alternate versions called alleles, and each offspring inherits one of those alleles from each parent. If they're the same, great. If they're different, there must be a dominant allele that's expressed, and the recessive allele remains hidden unless the dominant allele is absent. So, don't, like it says on the screen, don't use strongest to describe the dominant allele. Sometimes it's going to be darkest. Think back to when you were a little kid and you were coloring with crayons. If you color with yellow and then you color brown over it, you don't see the yellow. You only see the brown because it's darker. Or if you color the brown first and then you color the yellow, you sure don't see the yellow. So often it's not that we don't use the recessive allele. Sometimes we turn it off. Sometimes you just can't see it because it gets masked, gets covered by something else. There's the picture showing alleles. So, fourth part of Mendel's hypothesis. Somehow, some way, those alleles must separate, because if you get one from each parent, then when you go to pass them on, you only get to pass one along. So somehow, some way, they split up. Now that's called Mendel's law of segregation. We already know that. It's meiosis. Mendel didn't know about meiosis. We hadn't figured meiosis out yet. So law of segregation says those purple flowers, remember they were true breeding, so they must have been big P, big P. White flowers must have been little p, because all of these were purple. If all of these were white, he would have flipped them. He would have made these the capitals and these the lowercase. But in the F1, we were 100% purple because the purple parent could only donate big P's, so all the kids had to be purple. Then when we crossbreed these, now we've got heterozygotes, so now we're going to get that 3-to-1 ratio in F2 generation that we expect. So again, like I said earlier, really showed that the particulate model fit. So these traits are being passed as discrete units. I'll leave off there for video 1, pick up on the next slide on video 2.